Okay, well, why don't we get started? My name is Tara Mahoney. I am CEO of Equine Immersion Project, and I am thrilled to be able to host this webinar series as the moderator for Horses and Humans Research Foundation. The Education Committee has been thrilled with the feedback, and we are a jam-packed session today. We probably have about 2 semesters worth of information being presented today. So let's get started. We have Dr. Marc Crisman, Dr. Elisabeth Kutscher, and Dr. Andrea Suk. So what we'd like to do is let you know this is the part 2 of the journal review. This is kind of going to be one of those sessions where each of the presenters is going to speak 10 minutes on the journal article that was sent out to you, present to you kind of their opinions and feelings about it, their observations and their feedback, what was done well and what needs improvement. The next part of it, if you could take a moment in your chat session right now at the bottom of your screen, decide which chat room you'd like to be in. We're going to have a breakout session after the 30 minutes of presentation. Room 1 will be Mark, room 2 will be Elisabeth, and room 3 will be Andrea. So each of them have a different presentation, and we'd love to just get started since the content is so deep. I will be moderating and interrupting if needed. Please don't find that rude, and whatever isn't covered in the 10-minute slide presentation will be covered in the breakout room. Before we start, one other topic is 2 more webinars are planned for July and for August. July is super exciting. We have one of our board members, Nancy Paschal, presenting on research readiness for practitioners and centers, as well as Evelyn McKelvey, she'll be discussing the repository for research, which is one of the real big strategic plans that HHRF is working on. In August, we will have Molly DePrekel and Nancy Coyne, 2 experts in trauma. Really looking forward to hearing about what they have to say. So let's kick this off and get started with Mark. Mark, you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me all right?
We can. Thank you so much.
So am I doing my who I am thing, or am I jumping right into why I'm here?
Well, why don't you tell us a minute or so about who you are, because you're pretty well credentialed and that could take a half hour.
Okay. And Tara, I know I will be mercifully brief. So my name is Dr. Marc Crisman. I've been on the board for of HHRF a little over a year. In my prior life, I'm a veterinarian. I specialize in equine internal medicine. I spent probably close to 30 years. I did my internship and residency at Washington State University, and then I came to the Virginia-Maryland College of Veterinary Medicine for probably, well, like I said, in total, probably close to 30 years now. I'm 35 years old. I was at the vet school. I obviously taught veterinary students. I worked in the teaching hospital, where it was a referral hospital where I handled equine internal medicine cases. And then I also had a very busy lab. I was head of the molecular diagnostics lab, where we did a lot of work just in inflammation, metabolic syndrome, did a lot of work in pharmacology. I trained a lot of graduate students along the way. And so I'm still teaching at the vet school, but my primary job now is with Zoetis, which some of you may or may not have heard of. It's formerly was Pfizer Animal Health, but they spun off, and we are now Zoetis. So I'm one of their senior equine technical service people. We basically are consultants and help veterinarians out if they have any issues or problems. So that's my intro. So are we changing slides? Are we doing everybody's intro?
Let's just have you keep going, Mark. Thank you. Go right ahead.
Okay. So what I was going to talk about today, if I can find what I was, is a study that was, here it is. Okay, thank you very much. So this study was entitled The Feasibility and Acceptability of Occupational Therapy in an equine environment of youth with autism spectrum disorder. This paper was published in the Research in Autism Spectrum Disorders, which is a pretty reputable journal with a good impact factor. So that's what we're going to discuss, and I hope whoever comes to my breakout room got a chance to read this paper. Let's flip to the next slide, and I'm going to tell you why I picked this study. And I will admit there was some subjectivity and some objectivity in my decision. First, I was aware, I don't know them personally, but I was aware of the group of researchers at Colorado State that did conduct this study, and they do have a long-standing, very reputable reputation. A couple of things. I really liked the study design. I'll get into that more in a second. The next reason was this study was actually funded by HHRF, so I wanted to get a better look at that. And finally, I guess, you judge a lot of these papers when I looked at the conclusions. Were they relevant and were they actionable? And I felt that both of those concepts were there. So those were probably the main reason I picked it. And as I said, generally those journals that have a strong impact factor or fairly reputable, generally it implies that they have solid reviewers that go through the paper before it hits the publication stream. So the next slide, please. So the key features of this study were that it was a multi-site randomized controlled design. And for those of you that were on our little session last week, if you recall the evidence-based pyramid that I discussed, these types of studies, these randomized controlled studies, generally are fairly impactful. In the evidence-based scale, they generally rate quite well. So these randomized controlled trials are primarily for determining associations between different groups. So you may have one participant or one group of participants that are assigned to a study group, and then a second group that are assigned to, in some cases, a placebo. In this case, it was a little bit different, and I found that difference quite intriguing. So the purpose of this study was to assess the feasibility and the acceptability of a newly manualized assessment for intervention protocol, and this is specifically intervention protocols associated with equine-assisted services. They had 24 young participants, youth at age 6 to 13 years of age, which is, in a lot of these studies, that's a good number to accumulate. And this group was randomized to receive either occupational therapy in an equine setting or equine-assisted services, or the equivalent in a garden setting. And I'll explain that a little bit more. Their methodology was detailed, and their controls, I thought, were really excellent. The conclusion of the paper was that manualization intervention and the assessment protocol is feasible to implement and acceptable to both the parents and the therapist. So that's all pretty important. So the next slide, please. So what I liked, and I'm sorry for the busy slide here, but what I liked was, let's just start with the introduction. It really did state a very clear purpose, and that purpose was to advance the scientific basis of EAS, occupational therapy, in an equine environment. So the authors presented a really clear case for the why of the study, and they kind of hand walked you down the path to convince you that this is a worthy study. So I felt that was really, their introduction was really nicely done. Their objectives were really clearly elucidated. They had an overarching objective, which we'll discuss, and then they had multiple sub-objectives, and this was all set up and designed to validate their intervention protocol. So there were quite a number of objectives. The third thing was they had completed a pilot study that was published. I did check that out. So they built this study upon this completed pilot. And what the pilot did is suggested that they had improved goal attainment, behavioral regulation, and social functioning in some participants with ASD. But again, their overarching goal is to basically set up this manualization. So there were only, I believe, 6 participants in that study. So they corrected that, built off of that. The methodology, as I mentioned, was really well organized and described. But one thing I really liked about this study was that they did everything they could to minimize bias. And when you're working with a lot of people, and I'll get into that, bias is always an issue. So the study was conducted in both a rural setting and an urban setting. They had blinded raters, not Raiders of the Lost Ark, raters of the blinded raters. The parents were excluded, which, again, now I have to qualify this. This is not this type of study. These types of studies are not what I do. I am pretty much a straight-up quantitative researcher, but I can understand getting the parents out of the mix would alleviate a lot of bias. The students were all randomized into these dyads, so basically they were paired up with a therapist, and they had blinded raters that were, like I said, they knew the kids, but they were not parents. So it did have some quantitative data where they did take cortisol concentrations. It was interesting, they mentioned this in the methodology, but it wasn't reported in this study. So I'm assuming, like most people in academia, it's publish or perish, so there is another publication that will follow that will do that. The statistical analysis was appropriate. The results, they did have detailed p-values, they had means, plus or minus standard deviations, and very detailed parent and therapist surveys. The discussion was very brief, but to the point, discussed the caveats, future studies, and adjustments to their protocol. So the last slide, the next one, observations. In this section, they, like I said, they had a very accomplished group of researchers. A lot of them were out of the Temple Grandin Equine Center. This paper was loaded with acronyms. A lot of papers that have this many acronyms, especially for someone who does not work directly in the field, I would have really liked to seen an appendix or a summary of the acronyms because I kept flipping through the paper. My favorite one was this manualization therapy is called OT horseplay. That stands for Occupational Therapy in an Equine Environment, Harnessing Occupation to Promote Self-Regulation, Social Communication, and Play in Youth with Autism. Wow. Okay, I can see why they had an acronym. That one I didn't need to go back and look up, but, you know, SCQ, ABCC, I won't go into all, but there were a lot of them, and if you're reading the paper for someone who's not intimately associated with the field, it's tough. I mentioned many people involved in the study. There were 24 participants, 11 occupational therapists. There were 24 parents that had to fill out surveys, but there were also 24 blinded raters. These were, so the parents, like I said, were excluded, but still had assessments. There were 10 to 15 volunteers. By my count, there were over 90 people involved in the study over a 10-week period. All I can say is, wow. There were multiple surveys. These are all qualitative data that was conducted throughout the study. like I said, the methodology was very well described, but they had a flow chart in there, but it was difficult to follow at times. So there were really a lot of moving parts in the study, and it was a challenge to keep all these people together for this extended period of time. But in the end, 89% of the attendees completed this study. That, to me, is impressive. There must have been something there that they really liked, but I thought that was outstanding. So the last slide, Tara, before you cut me off, because I know you want to cut me off. I think, is that up? That's it. Wow. Oh, okay. I went too far, but okay.
Marc, that's incredible. Thank you so much. We really appreciate the information, and it looks like a lot of people are looking forward to getting more information from you in the breakout room. So Elisabeth, if you would mind taking over now, we'd love to hear from you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. It's great to be back with everyone this month. And so during my part of today's session, we're going to be going over some characteristics of high quality qualitative research. And also, like Marc just showed us, using an example from a published study to identify how people can communicate the rigor of their design when they're writing about their research. So we can go on to the next slide after the objectives, actually. Great, thank you. So before we dive into the article, though, I just wanted to give you an overview of the areas that we'll be thinking about when we're designing a high quality qualitative study. And of course, note that there's no way we're going to be able to cover everything in these 10 minutes. I'll try to even keep it shorter than 10 minutes if I can. But specifically today, we'll be talking about quality in qualitative research in terms of our participants or data sources, data collection, data analysis, and then the trustworthy of our findings. So on the next slide, you'll see for today's session, we're going to be referring to an article by Kathy McDonald and Michelle Zittimer on the experiences of therapeutic horseback riders within the context of self-determination. And specifically in the study, researchers interviewed 4 individuals with a physical disability who participated in therapeutic horseback riding in their youth. And I won't provide quite as detailed and well thought out justification for this article as Marc just did, but I chose this article because it's pretty straightforward. It has a nice connection with theory, and it looked like hopefully it was freely available for everyone, so you could access it regardless of your affiliation with a library to get access to the journal article. So moving into our participants here, we'll walk through the areas that I mentioned before and highlight how the article reflects some of these considerations for a high quality study in some areas, and maybe could have added some things in some other areas, because that's always the case for all of us. No matter who's writing what article, there's always something more you can add. So the article provided information about their participants or data sources by explicitly stating who they interviewed, and they also included a table with a description of participant characteristics. And in qualitative research, it's especially important that we provide a thorough description of who participated, because our participants are providing us with our data, right? So we want to make sure that our participants can provide us with the data for our study to answer our research questions. The researchers also provided information about their sampling strategy, saying that they used a purposeful approach. So this ties to what I was saying before. That means they purposefully selected participants who they thought could provide them with that high quality information. And it's also important as qualitative researchers to really be reflective and thinking about our own background in relationship to the research that we're conducting and the participants who we're working with. In quantitative research, like the study that Marc just described, we use instruments like surveys and measurement tools. But in qualitative research, the researcher, ourselves, are considered the instrument. We are the ones who are collecting the data. So we know that our backgrounds and our biases can influence how we're interpreting the data. So in the case of our example study, the researcher shared that she participated in therapeutic horseback riding, and she sees it as a vehicle for independence. So because of that, she might have been more inclined to notice when participants said positive things about therapeutic horseback riding. And maybe she might not have been as apt to notice if they had some criticisms or sort of more negative experiences. So that's something that she knew she needed to be aware of and be careful about when she was conducting the research, really being careful about that bias. On the next slide, you can see that our example article provided a lot of information about their data collection procedures. They stated the type of data they collected, which was interview data. They also described their approach for collecting data, which was semi-structured, meaning that they had an interview protocol. So they had a list of questions that they were going to ask their participants, but sometimes they might have rephrased questions or asked follow-up questions based on how the interview went. It wasn't a structured interview protocol. They didn't ask exactly the same questions of all of their participants. And they also used open-ended questions to provide participants with space to talk about their experiences. The researchers also described how the data were collected through taped interviews that lasted an hour, that were transcribed. And they also included some of their interview protocol questions, which is always a good idea so that your readers can understand what kinds of questions you're asking. And then finally, the researcher talked about her own priorities as a researcher. The next slide goes into data analysis, and you can see that researchers provided some information about their data analysis approaches. They talked about their analytic process, talking about how they highlighted quotes of interest, met to talk about emerging codes and themes, and they decided together on major themes and sub-themes. So they sort of talk about this analysis process. And then they also talked about methodological integrity, and they used a couple of approaches that are listed on this slide to talk about their methodological integrity. Specifically, they talked about triangulation, which is how multiple data sources, so their interviews, artifacts, and field notes, led to similar conclusions, which supports the trustworthiness of their findings. And then they also talked about how they reached consensus on their themes and sub-themes, and they used their field notes to reflect on and to support their work. Other methodological integrity strategies that are listed on this slide but weren't necessarily discussed in this article include things like member checks. So that's when researchers go back to their participants. So in this study, the researchers could have gone back to those 4 participants and asked about their reactions to the 3 themes that they found emerged from the data. So in this case, the researchers didn't describe doing that, but that's one way to support the integrity of your findings. Other ways include using data displays or matrices, as well as any checks that you can do to get a sense for the utility or the real life application of your findings. And then finally, really what this all comes down to is how trustworthy are your findings? You want to provide evidence so that your readers or your audience can determine, are the findings of your study trustworthy? And there are a couple of different criteria that qualitative researchers use to think about trustworthiness. So credibility is this idea, are your findings credible? Are they appropriate? Are they an appropriate interpretation of the data source or the participants' original perspectives? And there are several strategies you can take to support the credibility of your findings, including spending prolonged engagement with your participants. So for example, you're more likely to trust the findings from a 1-hour interview, which is what happened in this article, than if they had said, well, we did 10-minute interviews with 4 participants. Triangulation, which we just talked about, that's again when multiple data sources come to the same or similar conclusions, is another way to support the credibility of your findings. And member checks, which we mentioned before, is another way to, support credibility. Transferability refers to the extent to which your findings from one study are relevant to other contexts. And people really in qualitative research make this determination through your description of your findings. And often that includes using quotes. And this article included many quotes in their findings section. And that just helps support and describe the themes so that people can come to their own conclusions about those themes as well. Dependability and confirmability refer to the stability of your findings and whether other researchers would come to a similar confusion. Sometimes there is confusion as well in your findings, but hopefully in this case, they're coming to the same conclusion or similar conclusions. And this can be supported through the use of an audit trail, which is essentially a detailed record of your research process. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, an important part of qualitative research is this idea of reflexivity, reflecting on your own background and biases and how those might affect the research process. And you can reflect on that through the use of memos, which are sort of like journal entries that you might do. There are also some approaches for partnering with another researcher who can prompt you to reflect on these considerations using various interview techniques with you and this other researcher. And also as a research team, as was reflected in this article, you often will engage in this work, this reflexive work, as part of your debriefing and reflection process as a team. So that was a very short, abbreviated overview of quality and qualitative research, but hopefully we can talk more and I can answer some questions, and hopefully others. I know there are some of you engaged in qualitative research right now, so hopefully you can also share your strategies and experiences during our breakout session too. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Really great information and a lot of concepts that are so important. I kept taking notes wondering which one is it credibility or which one's more important. So thank you. I can't wait to talk more about it. Andrea, can't wait to hear from you. Your turn.
Yes, hello everybody and good evening. And wow, what a great night to be in the same room with such established researchers in the field talking about quantitative and qualitative research. To sum things up tonight, I will go over single case research design and some quality aspects. The next slide. And again, trying to achieve the impossible in 10 minutes, going through one of the example studies that again was sent out earlier. So next. So quick reminder from our last webinar a month ago, single case research is really coming out as having a lot of positive attributes to host on our types of environments, equine-assisted activities, because there is some great flexibility within our environments. It doesn't need a whole lot of participants and takes very few resources, both in time, financial needs, and support needs. However, one of the biggest limitations of single case research is that by publishing and having findings of one study, it will not have generalized effects. So kind of what we've talked about before is in single case research, you really have to build the mountain, if you will, of evidence by replicating studies over and over again with different populations and different environments to ensure that the intervention being used or studied is effective. So next, the example study that was sent out deals with the effects of equine-assisted therapy on gross motor skills for 2 children with autism spectrum disorder. It was done by Hawkins, Ryan, Corey, and Donaldson. And as you can see, it's just about at that 10-year-old range. So it's kind of, on this verge of, is it still relevant in the terms of research? Typically after 10 years, you have to kind of really figure out, is it a historical piece or are there new things that have come along since then? But I've chosen this one because it was published in the Therapeutic Recreation Journal, which has been around for 50 years. And this study would be primed to do a replication study of, because it's really good, it explains things, and based on its age, could be easily replicated to see if these effects are still relevant today. Next. So in this publication, there are 8 different sections, and we will not have time to go into all 8 of these, but I'm going to try in the next 8 minutes to go through methods, the implementation, results, and the limitations. Next. So first, the research question, to ground what was the question that these researchers had. And it was pretty much and very clear in that title of, if we're looking at equine-assisted therapy, specifically for individuals who have autism, do we see a change in body coordination, strength and agility, and gross composition based on rank score percentiles? So kind of wraps our head around of how we're going to be looking at this. So quick background information, this did occur at a university equine-assisted therapy program, and they used a multiple baseline design across participants. Again, their target behavior that they were evaluating were gross motor skills. During the baseline, before anything was put into place, they used the, and I don't even want to butcher that name, I'm going to call it the BOT2, which is a motor proficiency test to look at gross motor skills. It was the second edition that they used in 2014, and that edition is still sold today by Pearson. So it is still in its same edition. Nothing has changed about that. During that baseline phase, participants engaged in what they called a classroom session, where they learned about horse care and nutrition. And then this assessment was administered to participants to understand what the baseline was. Once they established a stable baseline for the very first participant, they moved that student into the intervention phase. Next. So the intervention phase consisted of riding. So participants would ride a horse for 30 minutes. And then between 5 and 10 minutes after their lesson, they would complete that same assessment again. Once a change was documented in that very first participant, then the second participant started the intervention, making it a multiple baseline design. Riding lessons were planned very carefully on the standards from PATH. So they did warm-ups and stretches, they had riding goals, and they had therapeutic interactions. There were 2 certified instructors who went into the planning process for this, and also a special education professor who oversaw all of the lessons. Next. So one of the questions that kind of came to my mind is sitting back of, okay, do I need this expensive instrument purchased through Pearson to measure my target behavior? Well, because they were trying to measure gross motor skills, that is the instrument that they decided to use. It was developed for 4 to 21-year-olds. It had specific gender norms. It had great reliability, and they had established validity for that instrument or that assessment tool. But you don't have to use a purchased assessment tool. It's important to ask questions with the research team of what is the best way to measure that target behavior that I'm looking at? Is there some research out there supporting how to measure this and a procedure to use? And if you're not using something that is published that has clear rules and procedures, can you clearly describe that procedure for measurement so that anyone could replicate it? Next. So quickly, the participants were between 4 and 14 years old, of course, had autism as part of their question. They had limited riding experience prior to this study, and there were only 2 students or participants who participated. Originally, they were more, but some participants were removed from the study due to some behaviors. So again, thinking about, okay, this study actually had parents and the youth provide consent. They distributed the flyer to the local community, so those who were not actually in the program at that point in time. And again, they excluded individuals who had behavior challenges. Next. Now, what they did a great job of, that I'm not going to go into all the details, but they talked about the implementation of the intervention in extreme details. How many times it occurred, how long it was, how many weeks it lasted, what horse handlers, sidewalkers, and instructors all did during the riding lesson. They talked about why they were using the English saddle instead of a Western saddle or a bareback pad. They described their ring being sand-based instead of the rubber-based or something else or outside in a field. And they specifically went into the different exercises and detailed exactly what they did. So again, anyone could implement this almost word for word. Next. They provided some great tables. This is one that I just won't go into, but were the exercises. So they gave the focus and then specific activities that were linked to each of those exercises. Next. And then with the assessment was used by 2 observers for every single session across all the sessions. So this way, 2 people were evaluating those participants, and they looked at the scores of both observers and found an inter-observer agreement of 98% for all phases, which is darn near perfect. That is exactly what we want to see when we are both looking at it for bias reasons, so there is less of a bias. Effect sizes were also calculated, which is a very new practice to single case research, but very neat at that time. And next. So to wrap up, I think I'm almost out of time. What's really pivotal for single case research is to include graphs in your results section, because we want to make sure that we see a visual change in that target behavior. So that first line graph at the top shows Emma's change from baseline to then the intervention phase after the dotted line. And after all data was reflected, and that we saw an overall increase of 83% in that intervention phase, almost pretty immediately by that second point in the intervention. And the next. Now, jumping down to Ronnie, we don't see an immediate change. And the change that we do see is clearly not as significant or magnified as Emma's change. And they demonstrated potentially a floor effect in the area of strength and agility. However, using the effect size calculations, they found that for Ronnie, equine-assisted therapy was still extremely effective, because he went from basically near 0 to over 10 in the percentile rank. So still a big difference for this specific rider. Next. The limitations, of course, is that it was very small. There were only 2 participants. So we cannot generalize this out to a larger environment. So hence we need replications. We need more people to do this and say, does this work? Does this not work? And next. Awesome. So I will end there. Anybody that is joining me in breakout room 3, we are going to go over the quality indicators checklist for single case design.
Andrea, thank you so much. Again, fantastic information.